On the evening of September 10th, 2012, a small village in France was quiet, but inside one home, something life-changing was about to happen. Jacqueline Sauvage had spent nearly 50 years living in fear, trapped in a cycle of violence she couldn't escape. But that night, everything reached a breaking point. Her husband, Norbert Moreau, was sitting on the terrace, drinking whiskey like he had been all day. Just moments earlier, the house had echoed with his shouting, his threats, and the sound of yet another hit. Jacqueline had been through this too many times before, but this time was different. Instead of waiting for the storm to pass, she walked to the cabinet, took out a hunting rifle, and loaded it. The weight of it in her hands felt heavy, not just from the metal, but from all the years of suffering. She stepped onto the terrace, took a deep breath, and did something she never imagined she would. A gunshot rang out. Jacqueline Sauvage was born on December 27th, 1947, in the town of Melun, France. Little is known about her early years, but it is documented that her mother was a victim of domestic violence. She grew up in a large family with 5 brothers and 2 sisters. At just 16 years old, Jacqueline met Norbert Moreau, a charismatic young man only a month older than her. He had an irresistible charm that made him the center of attention among women. However, he chose Jacqueline, and their youthful romance quickly turned into a passionate, whirlwind love affair. Their relationship took a dramatic turn when, at 17, Jacqueline became pregnant. On June 5, 1965, despite her mother's strong opposition and the unanimous disapproval of her siblings, who believed she was making a terrible mistake, Jacqueline decided to marry Norbert. She was deeply in love and, like many young women her age, dreamed of building a home and raising a family. Not long after, their first child, Pascal, was born. In 1966, Jacqueline gave birth to their second child, a daughter named Carole, just as Norbert left to complete his military service. During this time, Jacqueline took the opportunity to train as a seamstress and found work in the pharmaceutical industry before eventually transitioning into the textile sector. 4 years later, the couple built their dream home in a picturesque village located 80 miles south of Paris. The wooden and stone house featured a spacious garden and a terrace, making it the perfect place to start a new chapter. It was there that their third and fourth children, Fabian and Sylvie, were born. As the years passed, Norbert's professional career took a hit. In 1981, he was fired due to professional misconduct. Facing financial instability, the couple launched their own independent transport business. Jacqueline handled the administrative work and deliveries, but since she was listed only as a collaborator, she received no salary. By 1989, 2 of their children, Pascal and Fabien, had joined the family business, which had expanded to include wine sales. Over time, Jacqueline secured her retirement benefits, but she continued working. As their children grew up, they each went their own way, except for Pascal, who never married. By the time Jacqueline was 65, she had 11 grandchildren. She still lived with Norbert in their home and was an active member of a local hunting association. On the surface, they appeared to be a close-knit, happy family. But beneath that illusion was a dark and tragic reality, one that would soon shock the world. On the evening of September 10th, 2012, at approximately 7:30 p.m., Jacqueline retrieved a hunting rifle from the cabinet. She went down to the basement to grab the cartridges, then stepped out onto the terrace where Norbert was sitting with a glass of whiskey in hand. Without hesitation, she fired 3 shots into his back. After the shooting, Jacqueline calmly called emergency services. By the time help arrived, Norbert was already dead. The authorities found her composed and serene. She explained her actions, claiming that she had acted out of fear for her life and her children's. That very morning, Norbert had issued new threats. This time, he had vowed to follow through. According to Jacqueline, the shooting marked the end of 47 years of relentless domestic abuse. The torment had not only destroyed her life, but had also left deep scars on their children. As she was taken into custody, Jacqueline received devastating news. Just a day earlier, her only son, Pascal, had taken his own life by hanging. His motives remained unclear, but later investigations linked his tragic death to the years of psychological abuse inflicted by his father. During her first court appearance, Jacqueline recounted the horrors that had plagued her life since Pascal's birth. She revealed that it was then that she first saw Norbert's true nature, his explosive temper and violent outbursts. The first time he hit her was after a dinner party at a friend's house. She had received compliments on her beauty and outfit. On the way home, without warning, he struck her hard across the face. Shocked and confused, she was left speechless as he hurled insults at her. As the years passed, the beatings, sexual violence, and verbal abuse became part of her daily existence. None of their children were spared. Pascal, in particular, suffered the brunt of his father's psychological torment. Norbert would belittle him, humiliate him, and systematically break him down. The daughters endured even worse. 2 of them were victims of their father's abuse. Whenever Norbert's temper flared, he lashed out indiscriminately. The girls learned to survive by remaining silent, enduring the pain, and hoping it would end quickly so he wouldn't turn his rage toward the younger children. The violence began with slaps, then escalated to cruel words, brutal beatings, and acts of humiliation. At one point, he even hit Jacqueline with a motorcycle helmet, leaving her with a permanent scar on her forehead. For nearly 5 decades, Jacqueline endured a life of suffering. But on that September evening in 2012, she decided it was finally over. In her testimony, Jacqueline initially justified Norbert's behavior. She believed that his difficult childhood had shaped him and held on to the hope that one day they would become a normal, loving family. But as time passed, the violence became routine, and the fear of retaliation if she spoke out kept her silent. One of their daughters, Fabienne, attempted to break that silence. As a teenager, she ran away and reported to the police that her father had sexually abused her. But instead of taking action, the officer simply called Norbert in for a warning. Terrified of the consequences, Fabienne felt forced to retract her statement, leaving her father unpunished. That day, his rage erupted even more violently than before. Jacqueline, on the other hand, feared what would happen to her and her children if she left. With no financial independence, since all their bank accounts were in Norbert's name, she had no way to support herself. "What would I have done with 4 children?" she once said. "I stayed to protect them, but I couldn't." Norbert's control extended beyond their household. Under his influence, Jacqueline had lost contact with her parents, siblings, and the rest of her family. They had distanced themselves, unwilling to get involved. She no longer had friends either. The only social circle they interacted with was the one Norbert maintained, and in their small village of just 1,000 residents, it was as if Jacqueline didn't exist. There was a moment when she even attempted to take her own life. But when the doctor treated her, he didn't ask why. Most of the time, she simply endured the violence, waiting for it to pass. But the night she killed Norbert was different. Something changed. She saw a new, unfamiliar glint in his eyes, heard a threatening shift in his voice, and something about his shouts chilled her to the core. Suddenly, she could picture her children lying lifeless before her. He stormed into the bedroom, slammed the door, and told me, "This time, I'll finish you off." All at once, he grabbed me, dragged me to the kitchen, to the hallway. He hit me and screamed that he was going to kill my children, my brats, and that he would kill me too. That was when something inside me snapped. I don't know what happened, but I just acted. Earlier that day, they had argued over business matters. Norbert had been drinking since around 11 a.m., growing more irritable as the hours passed. At some point, Jacqueline locked herself in a bedroom to rest, taking some sedatives. But by 7:30 p.m., he had burst into the room, struck her hard across the face, and called her a lazy good-for-nothing, ordering her to prepare dinner. After that, he poured himself yet another whiskey, his fifth of the day, and sat outside on the terrace. That night, he swore he would get rid of them all. Jacqueline recalled standing there, tasting the blood on her lips from his latest blow. With that bitter metallic taste still in her mouth and a rifle in her hands, she closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The preliminary investigation confirmed she had an injury on her lip, but there were no other serious signs of recent violence on her body. No traces of sedatives were found in her system. Her trial took place nearly 2 years later, on October 23, 2014. By then, her case had drawn nationwide attention, igniting debates on domestic violence and the boundaries of self-defense under French law. Before the criminal court, Jacqueline pleaded not guilty, with her defense arguing that she had acted out of self-preservation. In a voice devoid of emotion, she recounted years of brutal beatings, humiliation, and abuse at the hands of her husband. The presiding judge pressed her relentlessly. Why had she never gone to the authorities? Jacqueline explained that staying silent had been a means of survival. She knew that if she ever exposed the truth, the consequences would be unbearable. She spoke of fear, shame, and the constant control Norbert exerted over her life. She talked about the times she resigned herself to waiting for the storm of his rage to pass, for the bruises to heal, for the day she might finally escape. Journalists covering the trial described her as distant and withdrawn, often falling silent when questioned by the court. When the judge repeatedly asked why she had endured so many years of suffering before taking action, she struggled to answer. In the end, she admitted that the final trigger had been one last insult, one more demeaning word in a lifetime of degradation, and that, in that instant, she had simply reacted. According to Jacqueline, the entire village was aware of the nightmare her family endured, but no one dared to intervene. People feared Norbert, and despite complaints filed by some of those he had assaulted, nothing ever came of them. Her 3 daughters also testified in court. The youngest, who had suffered both physical abuse and sexual violence, described her father as a monster. They all confirmed that Norbert and their brother Pascal had a tumultuous relationship that often escalated into physical altercations. Their testimonies were instrumental in exposing the cycle of abuse within the family and the sheer desperation that drove their mother to act. Neighbors who took the stand painted a grim portrait of Norbert as a violent and feared man. One woman openly admitted that, while it might sound cruel or unsettling, she felt relieved, even glad, that he was dead. In her words, Jacqueline had done them all a favor. A longtime acquaintance of the couple described Norbert as impulsive, aggressive, and prone to extreme outbursts. When the prosecutor asked why he had never intervened, the witness defended his silence, saying that from the outside, it was easy to judge, but few truly understood what it meant to confront someone like Norbert. After a grueling 5-day trial, Jacqueline's lawyers, specialists in cases of domestic abuse, argued for a broad interpretation of self-defense. They sought her full acquittal. emphasizing that she had been psychologically and physically broken for nearly 50 years. They insisted that, more than anyone, she knew that Norbert was fully capable of carrying out the threats he had made all his life. However, the prosecution countered that this was not a case of legitimate self-defense, as Norbert had been shot in the back and several minutes had passed since his last attack. They demanded a 14-year sentence. Despite her daughter's testimonies and the accounts of neighbors who vouched for Norbert's dangerous nature, on October 28th, Jacqueline was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The judges criticized her lack of apparent remorse, arguing that rather than expressing regret, she had positioned herself as a victim. They cited French law, which required that self-defense be an immediate response to an unjustified attack, carried out with proportional force. The verdict sparked widespread outrage. Across France, thousands took to the streets in support of Jacqueline. Demonstrators condemned the court's failure to understand the realities of domestic violence and coercive control. In the aftermath of the trial, Jacqueline became an unintended symbol of the fight against gender-based violence. The case ignited a national conversation about the long-term suffering endured by victims trapped in abusive relationships. A support committee quickly formed, backed by the mayor of Paris, environmental leaders, and left-wing politicians. Some women even staged a dramatic protest outside the prison where Jacqueline was held. With their chests bare and flower crowns on their heads, they began digging a symbolic tunnel, as if attempting to break her free. Jacqueline's lawyers fought tirelessly for her early release, and the overwhelming public support lifted her spirits. Physically weakened by bronchitis and chronic back pain, she was deeply moved when she saw the first televised demonstration in her name. At one point, she even laughed at the idea of her name being written across the bodies of the protesters. In August 2015, a local court in Melun denied her request for parole, stating that she had not shown enough remorse. However, the ongoing public outcry led to a second hearing on December 3, 2015. Her daughters had campaigned relentlessly for her freedom, arguing that she had suffered a lifetime of mistreatment and should not spend her final years in prison. Despite this, the Paris Court of Appeals upheld the original sentence. When the ruling was announced, Fabienne erupted in the courtroom, shouting that she hoped her mother would be home for good by January 28, 2017. Their only remaining hope was a sentence reduction. On December 22, 2016, Jacqueline's daughters secured a meeting with then-president. They pleaded for his intervention, requesting a presidential pardon to secure their mother's release. The public outrage over her conviction was so intense that the president took notice. Just 2 days later, he announced a partial pardon. Exercising a rarely used constitutional power, he urged the judiciary to apply the minimum possible sentence, reducing her prison term by 2 years and 4 months, just enough for her to become eligible for parole. Still, the justice system rejected her parole request twice more, despite growing support. Nearly 500,000 people signed an online petition demanding full clemency. More than 50 lawmakers, celebrities, and political figures joined the cause. Facing mounting pressure, President Hollande reconsidered his stance. On December 28th of that same year, he issued a full pardon, putting an immediate end to Jacqueline's incarceration. A prison guard informed her of the decision, asking if she hadn't heard the news. When he told her she was free, she raised her arms to the sky and whispered a tearful thank you. The decision was met with mixed reactions. While many saw it as long overdue justice, others criticized it. Jacqueline's supporters hailed it as a victory for domestic violence survivors, with some feminist groups calling for specialized courts to handle gender-based violence cases, similar to the system in Spain. Others, particularly the Union of Judges, condemned the pardon as political interference in the judiciary's independence. Despite the controversy, the case reignited a critical debate on domestic abuse and whether the battered woman syndrome should be considered a legal defense. It prompted lawmakers to push for reforms on self-defense laws, which at the time required an immediate and proportional response to a direct threat. It also reopened discussions on the use of presidential pardons in France. Jacqueline's newfound freedom lasted exactly 4 years. She passed away in her home on July 23, 2020, at the age of 72, after being diagnosed with a terminal illness. To this day, she remains a significant figure in France's history, remembered as both a victim of extreme domestic abuse and a catalyst for change in the country's legal system.